So if you spend any real time around a child or like a teenager, you witness this level of emotional volatility that would just be deeply concerning in an adult.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a wild ride.
Right.
Yeah.
Like a 10-year-old can experience earth-shattering devastation over the wrong brand of peanut butter on a sandwich.
Yeah. Total end of the world.
Exactly, the end of the world. And then maybe 12 minutes later, they're experiencing pure, unadulterated joy because they found a cool-looking rock.
It's exhausting just watching it.
It really is. That turbulence is loud, it's exhausting, and it is a completely universal part of the human brain just, wiring itself.
Right. We expect a certain amount of chaos.
But the documentation we're looking at today, which is Pediatric Bipolar Disorder, clinical support, and school wellness strategies, it actually forces us to look at the exact mechanism of that chaos.
Yeah, it really makes you rethink what you're seeing.
It does. Our mission with this deep dive is to ask the big question: when do those ordinary volatile growing pains stop being developmental milestones and cross the line into a serious systemic condition?
And, the clinical world wrestles with this constantly, mostly because the developing brain is inherently volatile.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think for you listening, understanding this difference is the foundation of everything else we're going to talk about.
Right. Well, emotional regulation takes decades to fully mature. When a child swings from elation to frustration, they are mostly just reacting to their environment with an unfinished prefrontal cortex.
So it's just hardware that's still installing an update.
Exactly. But pediatric bipolar disorder, or PBD, is a totally different mechanical process. It is a very real condition, but it is also relatively rare, which creates a massive diagnostic dilemma.
And that rarity seems to be the trap, right? Like a parent or a teacher sees massive explosive mood swings. They look at popular culture's broad strokes definition of bipolar disorder, and they immediately draw a line connecting the two.
Yes, and that instinct frequently leads to misdiagnosis. The source material points out that PBD is incredibly often confused with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, DMDD or ADHD.
Those are much more common.
Way more common. And those conditions involve severe impulsivity, emotional outbursts, and profound difficulty regulating behavior.
Which sounds exactly like the popular idea of bipolar.
What's fascinating here is that the underlying mechanics are fundamentally different. Understanding this difference is really the very first step in protecting children from improper care.
Okay, so think of normal childhood mood swings, or even the reactive struggles of ADHD, like the daily weather.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, so you experience a sudden thunderstorm, a really windy afternoon, or maybe a bright sunny morning. It changes based on the atmospheric pressure of the moment,
A trigger happens, an outburst follows.
Right, exactly. But pediatric bipolar disorder is not a daily weather event. It is a fundamental shift in the climate.
That climate analogy perfectly isolates how clinicians differentiate these conditions. They have to look past the momentary thunderstorms.
They have to look at the big picture.
Right. They look at the architecture of how a child is experiencing time and emotion. With ADHD or DMDD, the emotional shifts are minute to minute.
The storm rolls in and rolls out.
Yeah, the trigger happens, the child explodes, but an hour later, the baseline returns. The storm passes. But PBD operates on an entirely different timeline.
And this brings us to the core defining feature, right? The episode.
Yes, the episode. And the word episode gets thrown around so casually in everyday conversation.
Yeah, like, oh, he had an episode of the grocery store.
Exactly. But clinically, we aren't talking about a rough afternoon or a kid having a meltdown over candy.
Yeah.
We are talking about sustained periods lasting days.
Days. Wow.
Not hours, not shifting from minute to minute, but locking into an altered state for days at a time.
So it's a completely different scale.
It is. The hallmark of a true episode is a clear, definitive change from the child's usual self. It's a noticeable departure from their baseline personality that simply does not break.
Okay, so the clinical support strategies actually detail what an elevated episode looks like mechanically. You see an abnormally elevated, expansive, or irritable mood.
Combined with a massive surge in energy, yes.
Right. And the specific markers are fascinating. A decreased need for sleep, rapid or pressured speech, grandiose thinking, racing ideas, and risky behavior that is just highly unusual for that specific child's age.
And then eventually, these elevated episodes alternate with periods of deep depression.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. I have to push back a little here.
Okay, go for it.
Because a kid with racing ideas who doesn't want to go to sleep sounds like literally every child on a Friday night after they've had, like, too much screen time or a massive bowl of ice cream.
That is a very fair point.
Right. Kids are naturally grandiose. They tie a towel around their neck and think they can jump off the roof. So how do you avoid pathologizing normal kid behavior? How do you distinguish between a kid who just had a wild weekend and a child experiencing clinical pressured speech or grandiose thinking?
That is the exact friction point that makes pediatric psychiatry so complex. The line between a sugar high and a manic episode lies in the biological severity and the failure of reality testing.
Okay, break that down for me. Reality testing.
Well, take the sleep component first. Any child might fight bedtime. They might stay up late playing video games, but the next day they are sluggish, cranky, and just exhausted.
To pay the price.
Right, the biological tax of staying awake hits them, but the source material highlights a decreased need for sleep without feeling fatigued.
Meaning the biological tax doesn't arrive.
It completely bypasses them. A child in an elevated episode might sleep for 2 hours, wake up, and possess this boundless, buzzing electric energy for the next 22 hours.
It's terrifying, honestly.
And they will do it again the next day and the next without the physical crash you would expect from sleep deprivation. The brain is overriding its own exhaustion signals.
Okay, that is a massive distinction. That is a biological anomaly, not a behavioral choice.
Exactly. And moving to pressured speech and racing ideas, it is not just a kid excitedly rambling about a movie they just saw.
So what does it sound like?
Pressured speech has a mechanical urgency to it. It feels like there is a motor running inside the child's chest that they literally cannot turn off.
Wow. Like they're being forced to speak.
Yes. The words physically tumble over each other because the cognitive ideas are firing faster than the vocal cords can even articulate them.
And the grandiose thinking. How is that different from standard, childhood imagination?
Well, standard imagination has guardrails. A kid playing superhero knows fundamentally that if they jump off the couch, gravity applies to them.
Right, they know it's a game.
Clinical grandiose thinking is a temporary break from that reality testing. They genuinely believe they possess superhuman abilities or that they are immune to physical harm.
Which leads to the risky behavior.
Exactly. Incredibly risky behavior that is entirely out of character. But the anchor point, the phrase the source document leans on most heavily, is clear change from the child's usual self.
So context is everything.
Yes. If a child is always naturally hyperactive, that is their baseline weather. An episode is an undeniable climate shift away from that baseline that locks in for days. It's the cluster of symptoms sustaining itself.
Which brings us to the stakes of all this. Because if we understand the mechanics of an episode, we have to look at the consequences of getting the diagnosis wrong.
And they are severe.
Yeah, misdiagnosis doesn't just mean a label is incorrect on a chart. It inevitably leads to the wrong treatment.
The neurochemical reality of giving the wrong psychiatric medication to a child with PBD can be catastrophic.
Because of the underlying biology.
Right. Think about it. If a child with true PBD is misdiagnosed with ADHD, which, as we noted, happens constantly, they are typically prescribed a stimulant.
Which ramps things up.
Stimulants work by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain to improve focus. But if that child's brain is already biologically prone to ramping up into a manic, elevated state, adding a stimulant is like throwing aviation fuel on a campfire.
Oh, wow. That's a scary image.
It can directly trigger or severely exacerbate a manic episode.
And I imagine if they are misdiagnosed with depression during one of their low periods, and they're given an SSRI without a mood stabilizer, you risk the exact same kind of destabilization.
Yes, the medication flips the switch, propelling them from a depressive state straight into mania. This is why the source material is absolutely uncompromising on the diagnostic protocol.
Careful evaluation is paramount.
It is not just best practice, it is paramount to the child's physical safety.
So the text establishes a very strict boundary here. Diagnosis must always be made by a licensed clinician, period.
Always.
And it can never be diagnosed from a single checklist. You cannot diagnose a climate shift by observing a child having a hard week.
A hard week is just a snapshot. To diagnose PBD, the evaluation strictly requires collateral history.
Collateral history. Let's look at the mechanics of that, because gathering input from the child in the examination room is just step one, right?
Scarily step one.
You have to pull data from the family and, crucially, from the school. You are tracking behavior across different times of day and entirely different social settings.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, You just cannot map the ecosystem of a child's developing brain by isolating them in a sterile medical office for 45 minutes.
It's just not enough data.
The clinician needs to know how they handle frustration in math class, how they navigate the unstructured chaos of the playground, how they sit at the dinner table.
And what happens at 2 a.m. when the house is quiet and they're not sleeping?
Exactly.
It makes sense. Diagnosing a complex psychiatric condition from a single 45-minute observation is like a movie critic writing a definitive review of a 2-hour film based entirely on a 5-second blooper reel.
That blooper reel analogy perfectly explains why collateral history is non-negotiable.
Right, because you see a moment of failure, a moment of stress, but you have zero context for the actual plot, the pacing, or the character development.
Exactly. Schools observe the child for 7 hours a day. They monitor peer interactions, academic stamina, the vital transitions between activities.
Well, the families monitor the morning routines, the bizarre sleep patterns, the weekend crashes.
And the licensed clinician requires all of those fragmented puzzle pieces to determine if they're looking at the reactive weather of DMDD or a true episodic climate shift of pediatric bipolar disorder. They have to see the entire board.
But, okay, gathering all those puzzle pieces in the real world is an absolute logistical nightmare for a standard family.
It's incredibly daunting.
The source material outlines the blueprint for evidence-based care, and it requires an incredible amount of coordination. To properly treat PBD, the blueprint demands a combination of mood-stabilizing medication, which has to be managed by a prescriber,
Right, alongside family-focused therapy.
plus cognitive behavioral therapy to manage the psychological fallout and psychoeducation.
It is a multidisciplinary fortress.
That's a good way to put it.
The mood-stabilizing medication addresses the biological climate shift, but the CBT and psychoeducation provide the child and the family with the cognitive tools they need.
Tools to recognize the onset of an episode, I assume.
Yes, to recognize the onset, manage the environmental stress, and navigate the social damage that often occurs during a manic phase.
But coordinating that fortress sounds nearly impossible for a working parent. You have to find a prescriber taking new patients, find a therapist who actually understands the nuances of PPD, pull the kid out of school for appointment.
And somehow get the teachers to communicate with the medical team.
Right. But the sources highlight a specific structural model that is changing how this is executed. We are looking at how MentalSpace School applies this exact standard of care in Georgia.
Yeah, MentalSpace School provides a real case study in how to actually operationalize this massive clinical undertaking within existing infrastructure.
By providing K-12 mental health support specifically integrated directly into Georgia schools.
They aren't just an external clinic. They provide same-day teletherapy with dedicated therapist teams assigned per school.
Which is wild when you think about it. They handle crisis intervention, staff wellness, and family counseling.
And their clinical staff is licensed, diverse, and culturally competent.
But structurally, they are built to be diagnostically careful. They directly address the systemic risks of misdiagnosis that occur when a doctor doesn't have that collateral history.
That integration is the mechanism that changes everything. By embedding dedicated therapist teams directly into the school's ecosystem, you completely collapse the communication gap.
And you bypass the massive legal firewalls that usually prevent this kind of care. The document notes they offer support for HB 268 compliance, and they operate in a way that is both HIPAA and FERPA compliant.
That is huge.
It is, because schools operate under FERPA, protecting educational records. Doctors operate under HIPAA, protecting medical records. Usually getting those two sides to share the collateral history requires weeks of paperwork.
Assuming the parents even know to ask for it.
Right. So given how much coordination is required between home, school, and licensed clinicians, how does a program like MentalSpace School actually bridge that gap for a busy family?
Embedding the clinician resolves the firewall entirely. The therapist is part of the school environment, observing the academic behavioral record, while simultaneously operating as a licensed medical professional, providing the clinical evaluation.
So it synthesizes the data in real time.
Exactly. It solves the collateral history problem because they are already in the environment.
The documentation points out their integration scale, too, to make this accessible. They're in-network with major providers, BCBS, Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana and state networks like Peach State, CareSource, and AmeriGroup.
They clearly map out their infrastructure at mentalspaceschool.com or through MentalSpace School at chidikatherapy.com for school districts trying to build these systems.
So what does this all mean for the families listening? Because the mechanism that fundamentally shifts the landscape of pediatric mental health is their Medicaid policy.
It really is.
For families on Medicaid, the cost of this embedded care is $0.
Removing the financial friction changes the entire timeline of diagnosis.
Think about the traditional model for a low-income family.
Right. A parent notices the child vibrating with abnormal energy. They wait 3 to 6 months for a specialist appointment.
They lose a day of hourly wages to take the child to the clinic,
And then they have to try and remember what the math teacher said a month ago to relay to the doctor.
which is just incredibly inefficient, deeply stressful, and highly prone to that blooper reel effect we talked about.
Where the doctor just sees a stressed kid in a waiting room and writes a script for an ADHD stimulant.
And the campfire gets hit with aviation fuel.
Precisely because the system couldn't afford to be careful. But with a model like MentalSpace School, having same-day teletherapy means the intervention happens while the episode is active.
The clinician is already in direct communication with the school staff who witnessed the playground behavior.
And they pull the family into the loop. They gather the rigorous, multi-setting collateral history seamlessly because they are already living in those settings.
And making it $0 for Medicaid families ensures that complex, rare conditions like PBD aren't misdiagnosed simply because the family couldn't afford the luxury of multi-setting observation.
It takes the highest possible standard of evidence-based care and physically relocates it to where the children already spend 7 hours a day.
It empowers the school, the family, and the clinician simultaneously,
Yeah.
creating a safety net tight enough to catch the subtle nuances of a true clinical episode.
It stops the medical community from simply reacting to the daily weather of growing up and allows them to actually track the climate.
So to bring it all together for you listening, the reality of pediatric bipolar disorder is heavy. It is a rare, complex, and potentially dangerous condition if mishandled.
It definitely is.
But understanding the specific biological mechanics, knowing the difference between a rough week and a distinct, sustained lack of fatigue and racing ideas, is knowledge that empowers you to better advocate for the children in your orbit.
It proves why comprehensive integrated care models don't just treat symptoms, they gather the whole picture. And this raises an important question to think about.
Yeah.
We have spent this entire time unpacking the intense rigor, the cross-referencing, and the deep collateral history required to accurately diagnose one specific rare disorder. If correctly understanding a developing brain requires such strict, multi-setting observation over time, well, how much of the standard, everyday student behavior in our classrooms are we completely misinterpreting right now simply because our systems aren't designed to take the time to look at the whole picture?
Man, if we only ever judged the climate based on a 5-second blooper reel, we are missing the entire story.
We really are.
Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the daily weather, and as always, seek the full context. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.